Hello and welcome to SETI Live. I'm your host, Beth Johnson, Communications Specialist here at the SETI Institute. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please let us know where you are watching from. And also, we'd like to welcome in listeners on our podcast version of SETI Live, which is available on most podcast platforms. Ask anyone interested in space science, and you will likely also find a person influenced in some way by science fiction, whether they grew up watching Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, Stargate, watching movies, or reading books. Now, Ariel Waldman, filmmaker, explorer, and former NASA advisor, has written an accessible book featuring dozens of interviews that, quote, takes readers on a journey to the farthest depths of space, end quote. Please join me in welcoming Ariel to the live stream. Thank you for being here today, Ariel, and of course, welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
So that is a lot of titles, filmmaker, explorer, NASA advisor. So tell us more about yourself and some of your story.
Yeah, I have a very wayward origin story. I began in going to art school and getting my degree in graphic design. But several years ago, I very unexpectedly got a job at NASA after sending them an email on a whim. And that completely changed my life and got me interested in science and space exploration. And at NASA, eventually I ended up becoming an advisor to the NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Program, known as NIAC, which funds the more out there sort of ideas that could be transformative to future space missions, anywhere between 10 to 40 years away. So things that could be transformative to human spaceflight or how we could live on Mars, or also astrophysics research and telescopes, kind of just space exploration across the board. And so that has been a wonderful part of my life. But in recent years, I have become an Antarctic explorer. And I did that in part by working at NASA and learning about people who were working in Antarctica, and that it was the closest analog that we have here on Earth to Mars. And so I became a wildlife filmmaker at the microscopic scale to film all of the little creatures that live under the ice in Antarctica that we're often researching that could inform us about how we might find life elsewhere in the solar system and beyond. So I've been doing that for the last few years and just really love it. But as you can tell, I love just bouncing around between different topics a lot and learning as much as I can.
So how did you get into the science communication side of it? What led you there? Because I've known you for a while on Twitter, on social media, and that's how we kind of got to know each other. So how did that happen? How did that work for you?
I think it was kind of organic. So the first job that I got at NASA when I got that unexpected job was working for a program called CoLab. And CoLab, their mission was to connect communities inside and outside of NASA to collaborate. And they ended up hiring me because they were specifically looking for someone who had no experience with NASA at all to help bridge that gap between different communities, whether it be
Mhm.
startups in Silicon Valley or amateur astronomers, but someone to really think about, like, how can NASA talk to and work with people who have never interacted with NASA at all. So it was somewhat of a perfect position for me. I had worked in advertising before that. So a lot of my work in design and advertising was all about how do you communicate with people? How do you strategically talk to people and work with them and get them to be excited about new things? And so it was a really wonderful position for me to find myself in. And I think at the time, science communication wasn't even really a phrase or a job description.
Mhm.
Not to date myself too much, but it was definitely part of the job of, like, knowing how to really communicate to people effectively helps in trying to build, kind of a coalition of people who can achieve greater things together than they can separately. So a
Mhm.
lot of my focus early on was in multidisciplinary collaboration. And that was a lot of my focus with the NIAC program as well, of how do you get people from entirely different disciplines to contribute their knowledge and skills towards space. And so science communication, I think, really organically grows out of that, because inherently in having to engage people in different communities, you need to know how to communicate to them.
Right. That's definitely a very important aspect of it. What This is not your first book. So why another book? Let's start with that. There seems to be just sort of like a lot of space science books coming out, or maybe I'm just more aware of it because of how I work, but what got you into this book? What led you here?
Yeah, so my first book was What's It Like in Space? Stories from Astronauts Who've Been There. And that was a lot of interviews with astronauts, and it was a really fun book. This book, Out There, I wanted to do it because of a number of reasons. One was because of the nature of my job and the type of work that I do. I was interacting with a lot of different researchers and people in different disciplines who just have honestly a wealth of knowledge, and it's really fascinating. Not many people get to bounce between neuroscience to soil ecology and everything in between. Thankfully I do. And so a lot of wanting to do this book was out of that. The second reason was I used to have a show on Adam Savage's Tested YouTube channel before the pandemic, um, where it was a show called Off World, and it was about all things space exploration and pop culture. And so I would pull from my network of researchers and pop culture experts and writers, and we would use movies and TV shows as jumping off points for having interesting conversations about science, be it black holes or space elevators or the sun or what have you. And I really loved that show. It was really great to dive into these conversations with these amazing guests. But like so many things, the pandemic, disrupted a whole lot of things, and one of the things it disrupted was that show. And so I had all of this great content from the show, and I wanted to do something with it and continue sort of that mission of having interesting conversations with people. So I used some of the show, and then I conducted a lot of new interviews, and a lot of that went into the making of this book. And so I'm really glad that a lot of those interviews and conversations and topics are able to live on in here.
I was kind of curious about whether or not this was a mix of repurposed content and new content. So I'm really excited that you actually ended up being able to do both. Approximately how many interviews do you think you conducted to get all of these wonderful quotes?
That's a good question. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but but it's on the order of around 50,
Wow.
50 interviews for it. So, it wasn't hundreds and hundreds of people, but I was very selective in how I chose people and what sort of backgrounds they had. And it was on the order of around 50.
All right, well, I want to talk to you some more about the topics in the book, but I'm going to welcome in people who are watching from a wide range of places, it seems. I'm going to mention states and countries. So we have New Jersey, Romania, Turkey, Afghanistan, Kosovo, California, Washington, Alabama, Ireland, wow, Peru. This really is just a global audience. Germany,
Right.
United Kingdom, Pennsylvania. Um, what else have we got? I think that's it. Texas, Virginia, and Sweden. So wonderful. Thank you, everybody, especially those of you who are tuning in where I know that it's like late at night for you. Thank you for being here and joining us at such a late hour. I really appreciate that. And to Bernie's question, yes, this is Hedy Lamarr. I stole this background as a wallpaper for Zoom, basically, because I love her so much. And so now she's sort of like my default background for these things, because you're right. She's absolutely underrepresented and was not taken nearly seriously enough at the time. So thank you for noticing. Okay, so you have this book, and I'm gonna do the thing and hold it up here for everybody to see. So this book is called Out There: The Science Behind Sci-Fi Film and TV. So you have all these amazing interviews, and one of the things that got me here is there's so many different topics that you cover. I mean, it's extensive how many different topics you included in this. So out of all of these, uh, uh, were there any that didn't make the cut? And out of all of the ones that did, what was, and I hate to make you pick children, but what was your favorite? What was the most interesting one for you?
Yeah, so yes, there were plenty that didn't make the cut. I would have loved to include everything, but I really wanted to only include like the topics where we got into a meatier discussion, or something where the experts that I was interviewing really had a unique perspective. So yeah, there was plenty that didn't make the cut, not because they were bad, but because I was trying to pick from the best of the best. And in terms of favorites, though, yeah, I mean, I do love all of them, obviously, and they're all fascinating for different reasons. I think, in the black holes chapter, you can learn more about really truly the science behind black holes and a different way of thinking about them. Whereas, in the artificial gravity chapter, we're talking a lot more about concepts that we know physically are proven to work, even though they haven't been built yet. So that's much more sort of like how this would work sort of thinking. But personally, one favorite I have, just because it was different and delightfully weird, was there's a chapter. I'm going to get the exact thing of it. The chapter 15, Giant Aliens. Could there be colossal killer insects living on other planets? It's just so weird. And it's, obviously, based on the film. I'm going to blank on it now because my brain isn't working.
I'm guessing, are you going for Starship Troopers
Yeah,
on that
Starship
one?
Troopers. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so bad about blanking about the actual titles because I'm like, I know what I'm talking about. So Starship Troopers, and it's based off of that. And obviously, there's these killer bugs that live on other planets. And so for that discussion, I talk with a couple of insect researchers, and we discuss, what would be the conditions necessary on another planet to actually produce weird alien giant insects. And, we talk about how, given the right conditions that could definitely exist on a planet, you could have these insects. And in fact, a lot of them, even though they seem very alien like, and like they're spitting acid, and the acid, like, is flammable, and like, all these weird ways of being killed by giant alien insects. These insect researchers are like, oh no, those exist on Earth. Like, there are things that are directly mapped from Earth for that film. They're not made up. Like, there's insects that do these things on Earth. They're just really tiny. And yeah, if Earth had more oxygen, or if the insects were built a slightly different way, they could totally be like gigantic size. And I just love that because, I think with my last book and with this book, it's really about getting into fun, silly conversations that are both fascinating from a science perspective, but also just kind of delightful in how ridiculous they are. So that's what I really love about putting these sorts of books together.
It really is like an extensive. It's, if there's a thing in sci-fi that you enjoy, there's probably a chapter in here for you, and I love that about it. And you touch on a lot of different sci-fi, from, Starship Troopers, which, controversial opinion, I'm not a huge fan of. Book's great. I'm not a huge fan of the movie, but maybe that would be different if I saw it today. I saw it when it came out. I had different thoughts then. Um, but like, what sci-fi influenced you? What for you, if you were to say, like, oh, I mean, everybody here knows that I'm a Star Trek person. I do TV shows on Star Trek. That's, obviously my thing. But what was your major influences in the realm of science fiction?
Yeah, I mean, growing up, certainly Star Trek was always on at home. My parents were both Star Trek fans. My grandfather was a Star Trek fan. So I grew up with Picard and Janeway personally, and that was always just like a backdrop in my household. So I feel like it wasn't it wasn't necessarily something where I even acknowledged it, I think, until I got older, that like that it was just always there and it was normalized, and that was like a really big part of like sci-fi and dreaming about other things. Um, as an adult, you know, I there's so much science fiction that I love watching, and right now there's so many great things on. You know, there's Foundation, which I've been watching recently. Obviously, all the new Star Trek. The last few years was The Expanse. Before that, I even enjoyed Stargate Universe, which only had 2 seasons. And Andor, of course, is like absolutely beautiful filmmaking and world building. But I think for me, you know, it's that world building that is
Mhm.
what I love so much. Those things that really do spark that, like, oh, what if things were this way, or what if this device existed? Like, how would that change things? And getting to explore that, I think, is really lovely, especially the more you get into science, because you have this nice sort of merging of the what if questions you have from knowing what's possible in our current world, especially in the space exploration realm of being able to explore other planets and moons, and then seeing stuff on happen on sci-fi. So it's like, you know, you've got the movie Europa Report, which
Mhm.
maps a lot to the hoped, you know, Europa mission of the future. Only there's actual human crew on board, and they send people to look for life on Europa. And it's that nice marrying of like what it would be like between science and science fiction that I just really love. And I think Star Trek kicked it off for me early on, but so many shows are able to build and grow on that, and that's what I really love is a continuous iteration on thinking about what if and world building, and that we're not stuck with any one particular piece of sci-fi forever. That like this iterative process that humanity is doing in sci-fi is just
Mhm.
really cool.
That's I definitely see that that love in the book and the passion. Um, what was the most surprising piece of information that you learned in all of these interviews? Was there anything that, or, you know, it doesn't even have to be one or, you know, one or two, three. What things kind of like struck you that you were told and you thought, oh, I didn't even know that. I didn't think that, you know, what stood out for you?
Yeah, other than the killer alien insects that could totally exist on other planets that we haven't discovered yet. Yeah, I mean, certainly something that is weird and surprising to think about is that there are researchers today who are actively studying if we can do suspended animation with humans. You know, they're not testing on humans yet, but they are testing on, you know, small animals, and looking at biomimicry in a sense of, you know, can we do to humans what some other animals on our planet do, which is going into suspended animation, so that trips to Mars or beyond would be a little bit easier on people. I think that's incredibly surprising and has a lot of implications. And I think it opens up the whole debate around, you know, the line of pulling in fiction into reality, and you know, when we're ready to do that, and how it's done. So I found that really to be surprising, knowing that there's people actively working on that, you know, and certainly it's on the far end of more, you know, fictional sort of concepts. That's
Mhm.
really out there, to use the title of the book. Um, and looking over, like, I mean, also, I mean, equally on the far end of concepts is, you know, there's people who are continuously trying to work on space elevators, and there seems to be kind of over the last 20 years like a boom and bust of that industry, of people getting really excited for space elevators, and then like they hit a roadblock and it all,
Yeah.
the funding goes away, and then like a new technology comes out and people get really excited about it again. And so I think um, looking at the fact that there are some, you know, people who really still believe space elevators are possible just with the right material science, is fascinating, and knowing that it's not a one note story. It's not like, oh, because we don't have this one thing, it's never possible. It's this continuing sort of probing at the edges of our material science, to figure out if something could be done. And so that was another pretty surprising thing in working on this book.
So I have one question that has come in, and it was with a super chat. So I'm gonna go ahead and put that up here. So thank you, Anthony, first off, for the 249 in euros. They're asking any views on For All Mankind. Now I remember that this was talked about in the chapter on astronauts a bit, because you were talking about the views on astronauts over the years, going from that sort of glorified romantic, the right stuff kind of view. And then you talked to Emily Calandrelli, who's one of my favorite people in the whole world,
She's amazing.
about astronauts and the Apollo missions, and she really pushed the narrative that we should think about something other than sort of the Apollo missions when we talk about what the potential is. And For All Mankind came up in that conversation because, of course, now I haven't watched it, I confess. There's so much good TV right now. It is just so hard to keep up and do a job. But you brought up the fact that like there's this alternate reality of the space race and how it goes and how women were more involved. So have you watched the show yourself, and what are your thoughts on it then?
So I've only watched the first season, and yeah, like certainly, I similar to how Emily Calandrelli talks about in the book. It's really interesting to live in that world where what if the Mercury 13, the women who had gone through all the same astronaut tests and then in real life were not allowed to become NASA astronauts. What if they were pulled from and along with other women to become astronauts as a way of being competitive with the USSR. Like, so it's just really interesting setup. And I think the thing that I enjoy the most about that setup For All Mankind is because I think it's accurate in that women would only be involved if it was for a competitive warlike environment. We've seen this, with the Manhattan Project and other times of war, where women suddenly are given equal rights or equal access because it's wartime, and
Mhm.
thus like a lot of these more traditional roles and policies are sort of thrown by the wayside in the past. And so I think the setup from All Mankind for being like, oh, they're going to send a woman to the moon, we have to send a woman to the moon, I think is really well done in terms of making it a believable sort of
Mhm.
parallel universe, where it's not just like, oh, Nixon just wanted, to have equal rights for women. That wouldn't be very realistic. So I think in that way, it's really good. And I'm sorry I haven't watched subsequent seasons. I've heard that it's gotten better with each season, and I hope to get around to that too. But just like you, it's like I do watch quite a bit of shows, so I'll have to figure out when to fit in the second season and beyond. But I think they're promoting the newest season that's upcoming for that right now, so that should also be really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that has been really nice about all the streaming services, but also very exhausting with the streaming services, is that suddenly we have this amazing glut of science fiction television that we can watch. Not necessarily so much on the movie side of things, but I trying to keep up with Star Wars and Star Trek alone right now, because this is a dual religion household, has become a bit of a struggle. My husband's not into Star Trek, so he doesn't watch it with me. So I have to find the times where we're not watching things together, but he is the Star Wars person. So, and then it's like you add Foundation and For All Mankind and The Expanse and all of this on top of it, and I'm so far behind. Um, is there anything in like the recent sci-fi TV or movies that stands out for you as sort of like what you kind of look at as either the future of like where science fiction should go, or the future of where maybe space exploration should go?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say a dangerous one because I think uh, something I personally don't like is when anyone holds up any singular piece of sci-fi, and
Mhm.
says like, this is what the future of space exploration should be, or this is the direction we should go in, or this is how things should be. I really like the diversity of different science fiction, and I think it's problematic whenever we have this happens a lot with billionaires. They'll hold up like one piece of sci-fi and they're like, this was the future we missed out on, and this is what it's supposed to be. And that's so oppressive, and to me antithetical to science fiction that's supposed to really push you in many different directions. And the thing that's great, I think, generally in world building is having different worlds and everything to sort of play with, and not having a singular vision. And I think that's where science fiction can be a little bit dangerous, is when we point to something and we say, this is the future. I think, I don't know. I think it's a little scary. And I think, it goes back to what I was saying about, like, I love things that are iterative, and I love things where we can build off of them, but we don't feel beholden to them.
Mhm.
And so, one piece of science fiction that is a great piece of science fiction, but I think a lot of people think of it very singularly, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. Great piece of science fiction. I'm not arguing with that. But a lot of people look to that and they say, that's the future. That's what it's supposed to be. Um, Anything else doesn't, pales in comparison to it. And I
Mhm.
think that's kind of sad, because I think, especially when you're working in fiction, it's the diversity of ideas and worlds and possibilities, that are really great. And whenever we directly sort of copy paste from fiction into reality and say, this is here it is, your future, it's like, well, that's one person's future and one vision. And I certainly don't want to live in a world where we have a singular vision of the future. I want to have many different visions, and see many of them come to play. So yeah, I get a little shy about pointing to anything and saying like, that's it. But there's things, of course, that I appreciate about recent science fiction. So, I personally really appreciate in both The Expanse, but also a little bit in Foundation, that there's a whole political world that you have to dive into, about understanding the different factions and how they feel about each other and how they interact with one another. And I always like those sorts of pieces of sci-fi where you have to think about the social interactions as much as the like cool devices or whatever.
Mhm. So, we're kind of coming to the end of our time, and I don't really see any more audience questions. I do see one, and I will address it in just a second. So I I have 2 questions left. One, how did you go about getting, astronaut Mae Jemison to write the foreword for this? And, like, what were your emotions during that time?
Yeah, great question. Mae Jemison and I actually worked on the NIAC Advisory Council together. And so for a couple of years, I was working alongside her, advising this program about the future of human spaceflight. And we actually had a connection that started before that time. I forget which year this was, maybe 2010 or so. Around that time, DARPA held a conference called the 100-Year Starship Symposium.
Mhm. Right.
And it was all about, how do we get our culture, our technology, our politics, everything sort of aligned so that in 100 years' time, we could even fathom building a starship, that we could have the sort of necessary cultural infrastructure to consider something 100 years from now when things might be more possible. And it was a really fascinating conference. And so I gave the keynote address at that conference. And later on, Mae Jemison actually ended up taking over the reins from DARPA for the 100-Year Starship Symposium. And so we had this connection around that conference and sort of our mutual love of figuring out that really difficult social problem. And then, yeah, we later were working on the advisory council for the NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Program. In writing this book, I talked with her about it and asked if she would be open to writing the foreword. And I was absolutely overjoyed when she said yes, because to me, she is the pinnacle of what this book is really about. She went to space, the first Black woman in space. When she was in space, she quoted Uhura from Star Trek, and also appeared on an episode of Star Trek. And so she's always loved science fiction, and she's someone who's actually been in space and continued to do a lot of amazing work in space exploration after becoming an astronaut. And so I really wanted her to write the foreword because she embodies really merging science fiction and science together in a really lovely way.
I 100% agree with that. I've only met her the one time, and it was back when I was a baby science communicator, not even like I was still sort of figuring out what I wanted to do. And I would love to meet her again now that I'm full grown science communicator. Okay, so this is another question from the audience, and I was going to ask you what's next for you. And since we talked before the show, I kind of know the answer. But Zapfan is asking, what new things did you explore in Antarctica this year? Which dovetails into my question of what's next for you?
Yeah, great questions. So I went on a 2-month expedition to Antarctica. I got back in February of this year from that. I had a couple of different missions while I was there. The first was that I was an embedded researcher with the long-term ecological research team that studies the dry valleys of Antarctica, one of the most Mars-like places on our planet. And they do a lot of amazing measurements. So I worked as a researcher on that team. My other mission was to film a documentary about the dry valleys of Antarctica, which I'm currently working on right now. That film is called Antarctica Unearthed. Still in the depths of post-production on that. So TBD on when it comes out, hopefully next year. But yeah, that's really taking up most of my time. In terms of what new things I explored, I specialize in filming microscopic organisms that live under the ice in Antarctica, and filming them in really high resolution, because I learned that a lot of researchers go to Antarctica and tell us amazing things about the biology there, but they very rarely ever get a chance to actually film them, study their behaviors, and so on. And so I really fashioned myself to become a wildlife filmmaker at the microscopic scale, to really help fill that gap, both for researchers and to showcase these amazing creatures to the public.
Fantastic. And we will all, of course, look forward to that coming out. So thank you so much for being here today, Ariel. I really appreciate it. Once again, this is Ariel Waldman with her new book, Out There, The Science Behind Sci-Fi Film and TV, available now at your local bookstore or on any of your giant internet retail conglomerates. It is very, very accessible. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm definitely looking forward to what you do next. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us about it and for being here. And thank you everybody for watching. I think I have a couple more places. We already had the UK, but we've got Scotland, Canada, which I mean that's a big country. So I'm going to say that they're from Montreal and Indiana. So yeah, we've had, everybody's watching from so many different places, and I am thankful that you've all come here today. So thank you, Ariel. Just
you.
as a reminder, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. The SETI Institute survives on donations, and things like this, our science outreach and bringing these great guests on to talk about their work, is all basically sponsored by you for watching. So if you can, go to the SETI Institute website, SETI.org, and click the bright red Give Now button. You can support our science outreach programs. And of course, go and buy Ariel's book because it is really good and totally worth the read.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
All right, everyone, we're going to get going. Tonight is the Drake Awards. If you are attending in person, which I saw at least one person said they were, I will see you there. And if you are attending virtually, look forward to having you online with all of us as we celebrate our Drake Award winner and the other winners that we are honoring this evening. And if you have not gotten a virtual ticket for that, you can find the link to Eventbrite on our webpage as well. So come and join the fun this evening while we honor some really amazing people in science. And I will see you next week here on SETI Live with another fantastic guest. So take care, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.